Okay, welcome. Thank you all for joining me to interrogate this rather provocatively phrased question. Is Patanjali still relevant? Some will say self-evidently yes, and others will say not at all. And I'm going to try and illustrate why both of those perspectives might have some validity. And as a result, really, we're going to look a little bit at what's said in the text, the Yoga Sutra, which is the number one source for most people in the modern yoga world when they're thinking about yoga philosophy or the theory behind the practice. But also we need to look at the context in which that text emerged, because that's distant history, really, and culturally rather different to the world we inhabit as modern yoga practitioners. And I think we need to bear all of that in mind. So let me skip over the chanting and dive in to another way of thinking about this text. In the world of modern yoga, it is almost just taken for granted that Patanjali is the place to which we turn. And there are some good reasons for this. And I've plucked at random here from Light on Yoga by B.K.S. Iyengar, one of the most influential 20th century yoga gurus. And in that introduction to his, basically lots of pictures of postures, it explains that the foundation of all of this stuff is something that's a little bit different, a philosophical work from one of 6 different systems of what's called here orthodox Indian philosophy, put together by Patanjali. And this classical text, the Yoga Sutras, is the foundation of the yoga school. And all of that is true to a certain extent, although we can question whether there are more than 6 systems. It's all to do with how you define what's orthodox, really. The tantric schools that are actually the influence on a lot of physical yoga practice aren't included in that list of 6. So let's drill down into what's said about the Yoga Sutra itself. This text is very important because it explains the union of 2 things, the Jivatma, the individual being, and the supreme being, the Paramatma. When they are in communion or united, that is yoga. And as a result of this union, all sorts of funky things happen. To make it happen as well, one can enlist the body, says Iyengar. You send energy up the central spinal channel, piercing the chakras up to the crown. Now, all of that, if we were to summarize it in one sentence, is yoga means union. It comes from Patanjali, and it's all about the body and blasting through your chakras. And those are 3 completely different things, come from different places. The problem is, in the modern yoga world, everything gets jumbled together. So it is, I think, indisputable that Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is the foundation of the school of yoga philosophy. Whether that is the place for us as modern practitioners of postural yoga to turn for guidance, I think is a less self-evident question or answer, depending on how we might frame it. The reason I'm saying this is to do with history. And as I say, I think, we need to look at a text a little bit in relation to the context in which it emerges. This is a complicated timeline, which I've borrowed from the scholar Jason Birch. I don't want to get lost in it too much, except to illustrate that Patanjali, at the bottom of this chart, is trundling along for about 1500 years, independently of the green line, second from the top, of physical yoga practice. And physical yoga emerges about 1,000 years ago. It's a relatively recent thing in the history of yoga. Before that, there are philosophical schools of Vedanta and Sankhya. There are the tantric schools that come together to sort of influence physical yoga. And there is along the top something else that trundles along, doing difficult stuff with the body, asceticism, trying in a way to transcend the body, to stop being controlled by the body. And although there are 2 separate lines there, asceticism and Patanjali, I'm going to try and illustrate why they are actually speaking a very similar language, and the language they're speaking is not the one that most of us are familiar with. And it's really only in the last 150 years that Patanjali's been bundled together, all over the place with teachings on physical practice, or just generally presented in a different context to the one in which his text was studied by those who bothered to pay attention to it for this previous history. So let's dive down a little bit deeper into why we perhaps pay attention to Patanjali's Yoga Sūtra. It's because it's pretty much, exclusive. Not only is it the foundation of a system of philosophy known as yoga, but it presents teachings related to a word that has become very significant, asana. So translated here by Edwin Bryant as posture. And because the Yoga Sutra outlines a great theoretical framework for how to be a yogi and how to achieve the ultimate goal of liberation, and in that framework is this word asana. It's a very appealing kind of tool for the presentation of yoga techniques when people come along in the 20th century starting to popularize systems of physical yoga practice based on sequences of postures joined together. That's not what Patanjali is talking about here at all. He's just talking about sitting. The word asana literally means seat, or the manner in which one sits. It comes from a verbal root as, which means to sit. It's unequivocal. And until about half a millennium after the Yoga Sutra was compiled, you don't see any indication of anything other than sitting in association with yoga. The word asana has that meaning. Later, of course, there are other asanas that are introduced, and modern yoga is full of them. Iyengar's book having about 200. But when Patanjali is talking about this steady and comfortable position, he's not really talking about blueprints for how to practice all the shapes. He's instead explaining that in order to achieve the objectives that he has, which are to do with meditation, you need to be able to sit still. And the way in which you obtain a comfortable seated position is not by necessarily getting all comfortable. It's actually by letting go of the attempts to do anything, becoming deeply absorbed in a meditative state to the point that one is completely indifferent to all external circumstances. And this phrase, the dualities of the opposites, refers to that. And lest we be tempted to think it might mean something else, but we can turn to other sources to clarify. Throughout the history of the traditional transmission of the Yoga Sutra, it has been accompanied by commentary, perhaps even originally the earliest commentary having been written by the same author, some scholars now suggest. Not a universally accepted premise, but regardless, either way, this original commentary, traditionally attributed to Vyasa, has been consulted by all subsequent commentators and treated with equivalent authority to the underlying sutras. So it's basically footnotes providing explanatory detail on those lines. And it says here very clearly, the yogi who has perfected the practice of asana, who is unafflicted by the dualities of the opposites, is not bothered by being hot or cold, hungry or thirsty. None of this stuff is a concern, because he has basically anesthetized himself against feeling. There is no concern with feeling. He's insensitive to feeling. He's gone somewhere else. Now he's capable of meditating. That is the sort of steadiness and comfort that is being described. It's not necessarily, therefore, quite so appealing. And I highlight this not to try and say the Yoga Sutra is a horrible text, we shouldn't look at it, or to suggest everybody who's talking about it today is misleading everyone, although there is some of that going on. I think it helps us to understand a bit more clearly what Patanjali was teaching if we look at this squarely in the face, imagining the practice of posture as the foundational premise for being able to let go of the world. That is what early definitions of yoga are all about. The body is an obstacle. The body makes demands. Through the senses and through the impact of the senses on the mind, gets us involved in the world, trying to seek satisfaction, trying to find things that we like, basically, and trying to avoid stuff that we don't like. So the practice of yogic meditation was all about training oneself to switch off that system. A description here from the Mahabharata of one who is yoked, yukta, in a state of yoga, because yoga used to be a state. It was a way of being. It was a state in which none of this stuff was a problem. It wasn't necessarily a practice. Many different practices can lead to the state of yoga. The outcome, though, is that no sensory activity whatsoever, no hearing, smelling, tasting, seeing, no sensory impression through touch, no mental activity. So the practitioner is like a stone or like a piece of wood, an inanimate object with no desires. The problem is desire. Conquer the need to want anything. You've conquered the body. You've conquered the mind. You are then somewhere beyond. That's the basic framework for most early yoga practice. And it involves characters like this, emaciated world renouncers, living on fruits and berries, maybe just doing the bare minimum to keep their body alive. In other cases, actively letting go of the body altogether, because the body was not a concern. So it's the opposite of the idea of postural yoga to become more comfortably embodied and better equipped to live in the world. It's a completely different motivation. And this is where yoga comes from, the earliest definition of yoga in the Katha Upanishad. So perhaps, not quite a millennium, but certainly, many hundred years before Patanjali was writing, shining a light back on goodness knows how many previous centuries of people getting up to this sort of stuff, and sitting still, doing nothing, turning inwards, trying to become liberated from the problem of being a person, really. The challenge of living, in such a way that you never need anything ever again. And the way that you do that is to control the senses, says the Katha Upanishad. You control the senses, one of which is the mind. Once you've got those things completely reined in, no problem, no more distractions. You're somewhere else. You're set free. You've found your true self. It is not the one bouncing around between your ears with lots of demands saying, I want. That is not the true self. That's the voice in the head that we need to conquer, say early texts on yoga. So Patanjali, providing around 1600 years ago a summary of everything that's been said about yoga before that point, is really just explaining how to get into this state. And the foundational principle, therefore, is to let go. The only way that you can do that is to adopt a position that you're not going to be easily knocked out of. It's not going to be an arm balance or a back bend or a twist if you're going to stay there indefinitely, deeply absorbed in this state where you don't even notice, pain in the body. It's going to be one of these classical seated positions. And the commentary on the 46th Sutra, the very famous one in the second chapter saying Sthira Sukhamasana, the stable and comfortable posture, lists a bunch of postures, and they're all ways to sit. Some of them on the right, you might be tempted to think they sound like modern non-seated postures, or at least sitting while doing something else, like Kranchasana. No, the Nishadana bit at the back means sitting down in the manner of, sitting down in the manner of a Krancha bird, sitting in a position that will be able to be held for a very long time, sitting like an elephant, sitting like a camel. Even though at the bottom there is this indication that perhaps there are alternatives, but those are almost certainly alternative ways to sit, because the aim of practice is to sit still, shut up, and let go. Eventually, the aim is probably to let go of the body completely. The ultimate goal of yoga, where the Yoga Sūtra ends, the state of Kaivalya, is a state of absolute detachment, radical disengagement from the world, the absolute separation of the true self from everything else, including the body, the mind, the senses, the elements out of which everything is made, the material reality in which we exist, made up of these three tendencies, the gunas. There is no more interest in any of that, says the Yoga Sūtra in conclusion. That's when you know you're liberated. So in theory, I suppose you could still be in a body completely unconcerned with the body, but how would you survive? How would you feed yourself? We're left then, with a bit of a mystery, because Patanjali doesn't really expand. He just says that's the goal of yoga, to not have any concern for the material world. And again, that's not the way that we're led to think about yoga today. It's not the way that most of us want to live. And at the same time, I think we need to hold out the possibility that we don't have to throw the yoga baby out with the world-renouncing bathwater. There is some of what's presented in the Yoga Sutra that lends itself quite readily to the modern world. But if we're going to start cherry picking in that way, I think we need to first of all acknowledge the bits that we're not so interested in, rather than pretending that Patanjali's got a guide for 21st century mindfulness, because he's much more about this leave the world behind stuff. He's also absolutely not talking about union. Everybody in the modern yoga world likes to talk about non-duality, states of oneness, the possibility even of awakening to the divinity within. Sounds great, doesn't it? Your inner goddess energy, connecting to it. Patanjali says none of that. No, we need to separate. We need to distinguish the true self, the seer within, from everything else in the world that's the cause of suffering. And the reason it's the cause of suffering is we get so caught up in it, we've lost sight of this true self, this way of witnessing reality that isn't caught up in the body and the mind and the senses. Because those two things are entangled, he says, we suffer. In order to remove suffering, we have to remove that conjunction, the samyoga of the seer and the seen. Then there is the state of kaivalya, the absolute liberation of the true self. But what does that look like? It's pretty otherworldly. And the indications that come even before we get to this question of posture, of what we ought to do in order to walk the path of yoga, are similarly not really what we tend to hear about in the modern yoga world. Yama and niyama, people like to talk about. They say, oh, my yoga is not just about asana. I practice all the limbs. I start with my yamas and my niyamas. And I think we can probably all agree that the first two are, fairly important, non-harming and telling the truth. There's been a lot made of those in very worldly ways, for example, by Mohandas Gandhi in the 20th century, building a political philosophy out of the two of them. But for the most part, the reason that we hear about these 5 yamas that we get in the Yoga Sūtra is because they are well-established ascetic preparations for letting go of the body, the mind, and the world. And the Jain religion, which is where this quotation comes from, one of the earliest Jain texts, the Acharanga Sutra, probably around the time of the Katha Upanishad, similarly talking about early world renouncing carry-on, it's saying very clearly these 5 great vows need to be practiced unequivocally with absolute conviction, and they are preparations for purifying yourself for the ultimate practice, which in some cases is still in the world today, the letting go of the body, completely, purifying yourself to the point that there's no longer a concern for being embodied. And so these things are training. And the clue, which is always reframed, retranslated, reinterpreted in the modern yoga world, is the 4th one. Not stealing and no attachment to material possessions. We can probably bend those enough to say, yep, I respect those, but this renunciation of all sexual pleasures, brahmacharya, the practice of celibacy, that's the giveaway clue. These are vows for world renouncers. Patanjali says you have to uphold them in all ways at all times, to the point really where you shouldn't be treading on any insects. And in fact, the simplest way to uphold these vows is to never do anything ever again. And that is actually what the Yoga Sutra is preparing one for. That's where it's oriented. And if you're in any doubt, there's one sutra that makes it crystal clear, and when read with the accompanying commentary, is quite jarring. Although there are other ways to look at this. It's not quite so stark that you should give up your body immediately, but the practice of shaucha, the niyama, which is translated as cleanliness, purity, really it means. This is not about having a shower or cleaning your mat. It's about cultivating the understanding that it's actually impossible to clean this filthy body that is oozing substances out of all of its orifices, and that one day will fall to pieces, decay, return to the 5 elements. And then where will we be when we have this precious jewel no longer in our grasp? And in fact, the voice in the head has also disappeared. So the practice is to get ready for death, to become fully aware of this shameful, uncleanable body, to become unattached to it, and ascetic, says the commentary. As a result, you don't want to get involved with anybody else's bodies. You just want to let go of this body once you have purified yourself. Now, the Buddha said very similar things. In fact, a lot of what's said in the Yoga Sutra is very similar to what the Buddha said. And you don't find too many people today suggesting we chuck away the Buddha's teachings. So why am I being so scathing about the Yoga Sutra? It's to try and hammer home the fact that what we hear about it in the modern yoga world is not necessarily what it says on its own terms. But once we start to adjust to that, then there are ways in which we can find much of value in it, of course. And even in this idea of the contemplation of death, we are going to have to let go of the body at some point. You don't need to be in a hurry, but the sooner we are contemplating this thing that we're very attached to as a decaying corpse, the Buddha even talked about imagining it on a cremation ground being pecked at by vultures long after it's ceased to have any life in it. It's a helpful practice. So there are ways to reframe even the most extreme statements in this text. But I think we have to acknowledge that they're there first. Even this one, the one that perhaps the most quoted line after the stable and comfortable posture, the stilling of the mind, chittavritti nirodha. Yes, well, sort of, but not a few moments of brief calm after getting up from shavasana at the end of your postural yoga sequence. It's the absolute cessation of mental activity when taken to its extreme. And we know that because of the very next sutra. It says, once that is clearly established, there is no longer any interference of mental activity. It's possible for the true self to rest in its own clear, pristine nature, never again troubled by this stuff. So here, a very academic and technically accurate, although not very appealing, translation of the second sutra of the first chapter, the Samadhi Pada, the shutdown of the mental capacities processes, the full frontal lobotomy. That's the kind of thing Patanjali is aiming at. Now, of course, there is no obligation to go all the way with any of this stuff. And in fact, the general orientation could be interpreted as very helpful. As I said, we don't want to get too attached to the body. We don't want to get too attached to what's between the ears, because a lot of the time that's what makes us miserable, getting over-identified with all of this self-referential internal monologue. And there are people out there in the modern world, packaging this concept in very appealing bite-sized chunks that are saying things not all that different to what Patanjali is saying. The true self that's revealed, the third sutra of the first chapter of the Yoga Sūtra, is defined by the cessation of the activity of the mind. It is that which is not the mind. So turn to the power of now, maybe would be a more honest place for a lot of modern yoga philosophy to be sourced. But I think we can go a little bit beyond the popularization of these concepts into best-selling texts and understand where they come from, and even get a little bit more sophisticated in our understanding of what they mean. You have to become adept, says the Yoga Sūtra, at telling the difference between the activity of the mind and a state of pure witnessing that might every now and again surface for a few moments, like when the mind is quiet at the end of the yoga class. Paying attention to that, letting it be acknowledged, be witnessed, is the possibility of that being repeated. And therefore, there is something actually quite profound in the way that somebody like Eckhart Tolle is putting this stuff forward. But we need to be careful of superimposing that on the Yoga Sūtra and translating the text as if it says that. But we can, I think, move in that sort of direction. And we're invited to do that, I think, by the start of the second chapter of the text, which basically says, although this is an advanced meditation manual geared towards those who are capable of leaving the world behind, there are some of you out there who are going to come into contact with these teachings who can't do that. And that's how the commentary frames the very first sutra of the second chapter on Kriya Yoga, which is probably a more interesting framework, especially for explaining modern yoga practice, than the idea of 8 limbs, which is not a very helpful way to think of things, because it tends to suggest that vinyasa flow is a third of the way to the ultimate goal, rather than helping us to actually clarify what we're trying to do, which is to get less obsessed with the mind and the body, which modern yoga can easily make us. So it says here, if you want to get rid of your distraction, okay, then there are 3 tools: asceticism, tapas, svadhyaya, the recitation of sacred texts traditionally, but the contemplation of liberating teachings, and this practice of Ishvara Pranidhana, which is quite complicated to explain, has many ways of, I guess, being approached. But there's a description here in the commentary that's very like the ideas in the Bhagavad Gita, the offering up of the fruits of actions to something else, the supreme guru, the deity, perhaps even just life itself, not seeking personal satisfaction. That's the basic message. So if we simplify all that, it's something to do with the mind, something to do with the body, something to do with the spirit. And the body practice could be physical yoga. The mind practice is talking about this sort of stuff. And then in some way, we've got to get into a state where we let go of our self-centeredness. And that little cocktail of 3 things is a very helpful framework. And a lot of very useful practice can be built on it, I think. And the whole reason it's presented is to get rid of the afflictions in the mind. So never mind getting rid of the mind itself, be quite helpful to stop it being so problematic for us. And the analysis of this source of problem between the ears is very astute, I think, in the Yoga Sutra. It's identical really to the framework that the Buddha uses. This problem really of lusting after the things that we like, pushing away the things that we don't, and all of this being rooted in a state of misunderstanding, thinking that we are something that we're not. We're not the mind and the body. That will come and go. There is a way of perceiving that is subtly different to that. In fact, the nature of asmita, ego, is said to be total attachment to the mind and the body. This other type of clinging, abhinivesha, clinging to the idea of staying alive in the body because we're so mistakenly attached to it. So somehow loosening the grip of this addiction to the thought process and this physical container as the source of our identity is going to be helpful. But that's going to need to be talked about and seeded in some way, practiced. What are the practices that counteract these tendencies? Well, there's some things said about that in the commentary accompanying the sutras, not a lot said in the sutras, not a lot said in most modern yoga classes. In fact, there's often quite an increase of attachment to the body through the performance of all sorts of postures until the body starts to break down. And then we feel a little bit lost, as I have discovered for myself in recent years. So just as a sort of pointer, that's where we start to really get into the useful framework for philosophy. And ultimately, the whole point of yoga is to stop us from suffering. And the analysis of how that works, identical again to what the Buddha has to say. Yoga works like medicine. It does so as it has 4 components. The components really are to see that there is suffering. There is a reason for suffering. There is also the possibility of eliminating this problem of suffering, and there is some kind of medicine that will help. And the Buddha built that into his 4 Noble Truths. The Yoga Sutra is doing exactly the same thing. And it's just got a fairly radical analysis. The problem is being caught up in the cycle of births. Therefore, the means to liberation is to let go of attachment to the world. But we can make our own framework for how to avoid suffering. We can also stop having this crazy goal that we'll never suffer. I mean, if we get enlightened, wonderful. But in the meantime, we could actually just be orienting ourselves towards the unwinding of suffering rather than the accumulation of increasingly knotted states of confusion. So again, wonderful tools there to work with, but we'll have to reframe them. And to be acknowledging that, honest about it, conscious of it, I think is helpful. And then finally, we come back to asana. So people like to say, well, just do your practice, you get concentrated, it's a moving meditation, it's got this energetically liberating capacity built into it, thanks to later Hatha Yoga teachings. Why ask all these questions, especially when the word for 8 limbs becomes the branding for a modern postural yoga system, Ashtanga. Well, I don't wish to denigrate modern postural yoga. I practice it. I like it. I'm not trying to say we should stop. I think we just need to question how far it can go. But it can go a long way, provided we approach it in certain ways. It doesn't work automatically. There are systems that do encode what I'm about to say very well. And in some ways, if practiced as originally presented, this Ashtanga framework can be quite useful from this point of view because it develops concentration. The whole key to Patanjali's system of yoga is to develop a concentrated mind. And in the end, he says in the 39th Sutra of the first chapter, whatever works to steady your mind is good. It doesn't matter. Anything will do. What matters is a steady mind. And then you can turn that mental steadiness towards the slow unwinding of identification with anything out there in the material world. Or you could turn that to all manner of misbehavior. You could become a mindful sniper or whatever else you might feel called to do with a steady mind. So it's kind of neutral. There's an ethical framework geared towards leaving the world behind. But if you leave behind leaving the world behind, maybe we'll need a new ethical framework. Maybe we'll need all sorts of other things. Maybe we'll need to write our own yoga philosophy. But that doesn't mean that we can't be inspired by the Yoga Sutra in the process. So that's the way that I like to look at these things. But I think that requires us to acknowledge, as I wrote in my book, The Truth of Yoga, that a lot of what we hear about what Patanjali says is not necessarily something he would recognize if we could resurrect him to come back and pass judgment. And as long as we're clear about that, we're probably engaged in the same process that he was, pulling together bits of teachings that seem useful to us, presenting them in a way that serve our objectives, and moving forwards. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with cherry picking from the Yoga Sutra, but it helps to admit that's what we're doing. So in order to do that, we first have to know what it actually says. And yeah, one of the reasons I'm talking about all of this is because I would like to invite you, if you would like to dive a bit deeper, to join me for a 4-week immersion in the whole text, sutra by sutra, analyzing through the prism of Edwin Bryant's very helpful edition that includes, it's quite chunky because it includes summaries of what all of the traditional commentaries that have been most influential over the evolution of this system of philosophy say about these little sutras, rather than leaving them up to us to reinterpret in any way that we see fit. So we can at least see what we're working with, and then that will help us to think about how to remix things to suit ourselves. So that will start Monday, June the 5th. Each week there are 3 pre-recorded videos with an explanation of what's going on in the text. And then we meet at the end of the week on a Sunday evening for a session a bit like the one that we're about to get into, where we bring our questions and have a discussion together. And all of that conducted live on Zoom, but also recorded in case you can't make the live session. So you can find out more about that at truthofyoga.com. When I send out the recording, I'll send you a link if you want to investigate further. And if you do so in the next few days, you can benefit from a discount. You can use this coupon code, which I'll also add to the email, to get 10% off, and that will run until midnight on Friday. So enough of me. Gone on a couple minutes longer than I said I would, so time I stopped and turned it over to anyone who would like to ask questions. So as I said at the start, you're welcome to do that either by speaking out or by typing them. I think, see most faces, so feel free either to wave at me or just unmute yourself and shout out. All questions welcome. And somebody did email me some, which I'm going to dig out just in case we need to slowly start. It's never the most tempting to be the first, but I encourage you to not be shy or perhaps to take advantage of typing, and then we'll dive in and see where we might go next. Okay, well, I'm going to start with one of these questions on my list that somebody sent me by email. Defining yoga in the second sutra, often quoted as the one true definition of yoga. But aren't there many definitions of yoga? Yes, there are. We've got this sort of fixation on the Yoga Sutra for all sorts of reasons, some of which are explored in this book, which is quite a helpful one that I draw on a little bit in the course, by David Gordon White's The Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, a biography, which is basically a history of the ways in which people have interpreted this text and what they've done with it. It's had its own life, really, but it's been to a certain extent independent of yoga practice. It's had an association with deep meditative practice, and it's been remembered because it's this root text of a school of philosophy. So many people were aware of what it said, even if they didn't do anything with it. But there've been lots of other people doing things known as yoga who had slightly different motivations. However, I think most systems of yoga do include an emphasis on inward focus and, to some degree, concentration training. And refining the capacity to pay attention is fundamental to other objectives in yoga, be they visualization techniques, even the accumulation of magic powers that Patanjali talks about in his 3rd chapter that never gets much attention in modern yoga teacher trainings. That's all dependent on the ability to focus. But the focusing might not be the ultimate goal. The focusing might be a stepping stone towards communion with a deity, for example, which definitely isn't the end result of Patanjali's text. So there are many ways to approach yoga, and there's no way that Patanjali is the gold standard, but he does share some very useful principles that are, I think, consistent across different traditions. Any other questions or reflections? got one here in the chat saying, could this desire to not be reborn be perceived as nihilistic in some way? Is life really so bad? It's an excellent question. I think, that's taking us right to the core of what we need to confront. This is a text coming from a culture and time that is quite far removed from the one we inhabit. At that time, this question of the problem of karma, the problem of action, the fact that action has an impact on the mind, that what we do shapes how we think, which shapes how we behave, which means the thing spirals around and get round and around, is said to span across lifetimes. And the ultimate goal is to try and shut it down. And now this was a worldview common to most ancient Indian religions. And it doesn't come from the earliest text that we have from the Vedas. It seems to have emerged somewhere on the fringes of Vedic society, perhaps even beyond it. And it's there at the root of the Buddhist tradition also. And it's not so much that this life is so terrible that we need to immediately end it. It's more that because of the way we relate to existence, we're conditioned to suffer. The nature of that suffering is described in terms of multiple lives, but we can see it within the course of this one lifetime that we know very well, that we get stuck in unhelpful patterns. Things seem to repeat themselves and tendencies within us get reinforced. And the practice of yoga is actually a way to become more conscious of that. And even if we don't unwind the cycles to leave behind this worldly existence, we might be able to be more comfortably embodied, but we would need to engage with this cyclical process of reinforcement of tendencies through the way we relate to things. So yes, it might well be that to us here and now, that ancient perspective is so otherworldly that we don't really know how to engage with it. But I think we still can get inspired by a dimension of it, especially when we see that the root of this whole way of seeing was to eliminate the problem of dukkha, the problem of suffering, the problem of the fact that we can never make ourselves satisfied through attempts to grasp objects of desire that might stimulate us through the senses. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we can't live in the world and have a handle on desire and be a bit more skillful with it. And some of us will probably agree that we'll accept a certain amount of suffering in exchange for having desires and being involved with other people and having worldly commitments. And that's part of the choice we make. And I think we also have to acknowledge that this was not the majority perspective, even at the time of Patanjali or 2,500 plus years ago in the earliest of the Upanishads. It's a perspective shared really by the committed who are absolutely on the way to trying to do something about it. It's one paid lip service to by others who just, I think, accept the fact that it's the nature of life. It moves in cycles. What we do shapes what we become. We need to be mindful of that, but most people might not think that it's possible to unwind it, and therefore they might not have the sense that life's so miserable they have to let go of it completely. They might just be better equipped to understand some of that patterning. So if the word yoga doesn't mean union, what's the real meaning? Well, union is one of the meanings. It comes, the word yoga in Sanskrit, from a verbal root, yuj. And the word yuj can be used to form, I think, 3 different verbs. One of those verbs is to join things together, to unite. The other, which has sort of another flavor to it, it's the sort of secondary one, which is the main alternative to uniting, is about concentration. So the yoking of the mind perhaps to an object of focus. So there is, in a sense, a connection going on there, but as Patanjali is explaining, you don't want to get too attached to this object on which we focus. We want to use the focusing to get subtler and subtler, being able in the end to not need an object to focus on, to just detach with pure observing and never again to be engaged with objects of anything. So in that sense, I think there's probably 2 ways that we can think of yoga. Rather than union, perhaps if we think of connection, there are some systems in which the ultimate goal is connection with the deity, perhaps even becoming like the deity or becoming of the deity, making over one's body so that one is divine. So that connection theme is definitely there. but that's not Patanjali's message. He's more in the concentration camp. So those two words, I think, sum up the two major tendencies. There's another verb which has more of a binding sense to it, which is similar to what Patanjali calls samyama in the third chapter of the Yoga Sūtra, the refinement of meditation. So you can really lock on to an object of focus and generate what this other question asked about. Siddhis, magic powers. Why does Patanjali spend so much time talking about siddhis? There's a lot more about siddhis than there is about postures. In fact, there's probably more about these magic powers than there is about anything else in the text. 36 sutras talking about the fruits of samyama on these various objects. And some of them are pretty otherworldly. And I think, again, we have to engage with that on its own terms. It's very tempting to try and explain it away and say, oh, it's just a metaphor, and perhaps it wasn't really meant that way, or perhaps yogis thought they were having these kinds of experiences. But there's always been a tradition of speaking about the accumulation of supernatural powers through yogic practice. And so Patanjali, again, dutifully summing up everything that has been said before him, really needs to deal with that. But he goes into much more depth than many other sources on the subject. And so I think we do need to ask why. And I think the answer is perhaps embedded in the philosophy on which the Yoga Sutras is built, the Sankhya system, which consists of analyzing the component parts of reality. And those consist of the elements out of which everything is made, and the ways in which we engage with the world through the minds and the senses and the body. And becoming so subtle in our awareness of how this all works that we can even distinguish between the subtlest part of the mind and eventually just the pure state of witnessing that is the true self, to the point we can let go of all of it. And if one is actually able to do that, refining awareness to the point that you can see all of it in all of its complexity and turn away from it, you've basically gained mastery over the process by which Sankhya philosophy said that the world was created. It all emerges out of formlessness, becoming ever more solidified until you get the 5 root elements, earth, fire, water, air, and space. All of that, kind of constructed out of this formless prakriti. And if you're able to rewind your awareness back to the formless and disengage from it, then in theory, you've generated some sort of meditative stem cell capacity, where in theory you've got control over the process of evolution, because you can rewind back to nothingness, and in theory then unwind again back to somethingness. And so I think embedded in that is in this essential idea of mastery over material things, including the mind, the body, and the senses, but perhaps also the outside world, perhaps other people's minds, bodies, and senses, as some of those powers suggest. Whether anybody out there who we can go and encounter in the world today can show us how to do all that, that's a more complicated question. But I think conceptually, that's one of the reasons why it's so important. It's a demonstration. It's proof of the capacity to be able to leave all of that behind. And at the very end of that chapter, Patanjali says, if you really want to get liberated, that's what you have to do. Even omnipotence and omniscience, let go of that. You need to just rest forever in your true nature. That's all you need. But there are other schools of yoga that are all about the powers. So I think he felt the need to make it clear. Do you think it's appropriate to apply the concepts of Patanjali's teachings to modern postural practice? It's a very good question. I think we can, and I think people have. But whether we should, whether they're the most helpful tools or not, I think that's an open question. I would say that what Patanjali is presenting, as I was trying to highlight really, is a much more helpful guide to the problem of the mind than the control of the body. And perhaps we can go about the practice in such a way that we develop the concentration that will help us to get control over the mind. But really to make some progress with that, dealing with the problem of affliction, I think we need some other practices. And the Buddhist tradition articulates these a lot more clearly, counteracting those difficult negative tendencies that we might identify in craving and aversion. I mean, a little bit of craving, perhaps no harm, but being a slave to it, being an addict, we're losing control. And so that can perhaps be counteracted by, as Patanjali, the commentary accompanying the sutras puts it, by the cultivation of the opposite tendency. And say the Buddha would talk a lot about, you get rid of your greed by being generous. Give everything away. You can't be greedy. You can't be desiring everything your own way, getting more of what you like. Similarly, rather than developing aversion to things and getting caught up in hatred and anger, loving kindness, compassion, these are the opposites that help to develop that. And those are qualities, and we can talk about them and we can think about how to make them more active in our lives. But that's not necessarily going to happen through asana practice. And I would argue, in a way, it's more important to carve out a few minutes to think about these things and at least go away with some action points that might relate to the rest of our lives, and to see asana for what it is. It's got its beauty, it's got its merits, but I don't know that it's the transformative aspect, certainly not in Patanjali's system. So if we're going to actually refer to Patanjali's system, the thing that's truly transformative is this ability to see beyond the mind. And if we can't do that all the time, which I would say is probably true for most of us, we can still make some entry-level progress with making a bit more space, which might help us to be less afflicted, and thinking about how to engage with that. Maybe then one-pointed focus on asana is a helpful tool, but I would question whether it's the most useful framework. Nicholas.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Hey, sorry, I missed the whole beginning of your presentation.
No worries.
I'm glad I could join now. On the similar topic as the question about asana and Yoga Sūtra, in modern yoga, we hear always stira sukham asanam, and people talk about this as a way to show how Patanjali suggested going about doing asana. And I don't know if you mentioned that in the talk before, but my understanding is that at that time, that's not what he didn't have in mind an indication of how you were supposed to do postures or stretching. And it was just to say that if you're going to meditate and do some concentration practice, you should probably be reasonably comfortable and not too comfortable that you would fall asleep. Is that understanding correct? And why
correct.
Why do we keep hearing this as, how to practice asana, and it's repeated over and over?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't have the definitive answer, but I do think that one of the reasons is that in the modern yoga world, there's this desire for authenticity. And some of the most influential teachers in spreading yoga to the West, I'm thinking particularly of Vivekananda, who had such an impact at the late 19th century, coming to speak in the United States. And then Krishnamacharya, very influential in the spread of various postural yoga systems internationally, set great store by this text, saw in it a framework for presenting ideas more broadly, even though what they were actually teaching is not really what Patanjali is talking about. Vivekananda basically teaching Advaita Vedanta, and Krishnamacharya basically teaching Hatha Yoga. But it's a great way to anchor that in a very respected idea that's based on direct perception, that has a long history, and from the point of view of postural yoga practice, has the word asana in this 8-part framework that everybody gets so excited about. And so it's just got this suggestion immediately encoded in it that there's a place for asana. Asana is important. It's basically be nice to people, do your asana practice, and you're 3/8 of the way there. Wonderful. But that's definitely not what Patanjali had in mind. He's saying if you want to meditate, you need to sit still. And then he explains that in order to be able to sit still, not even that your posture needs to be steady and comfortable. It becomes steady and comfortable because you stop wanting it to be. You stop doing anything other than just relaxing into your meditation. And there's a commentary that comes after the earliest one by Vachaspati Mishra, somewhere around 1,000 years ago. And he goes into a bit more detail about this letting go of effort that accompanies asana. There's the 47th Sutra after the 46th that says it should be steady and comfortable. The 47th Sutra says it comes that way by letting go of effort. And Vachaspati says, well, the effort that's directed towards the accomplishment of a certain posture would help to keep the body in a particular position. But this is not the cause of the posture which is being presented here. It's not about making an effort. because otherwise the posture would be achieved by just adopting it. Instead, what's being said is, in fact, the opposite. This natural effort being the antecedent of the posture that may at any time be desired does away with the very object of posture. A bit flowery language, not very modernly translated, but it says, if you want to practice posture the way it's suggested, you should employ an effort which consists in suppressing the natural efforts of the body. Otherwise, the asana that's being explained will not be accomplished. So that's not really compatible with making another shape, because it immediately removes the intentional sort of directionality of adopting any particular position whatsoever. It says you just have to let go of the body. That's the whole practice of yoga. Asana is the first step, being able to just sit there, not concerned with the body.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
It's pretty much other to what we hear, but actually at the same time, the whole notion of effortless effort, the balance. There's a lot of talk in yoga about balance. Patanjali with his concept of abhyasa, which is repeatedly concentrating, and vairagya, detachment, ultimately from the world. That balance of doing a little bit of directional intent and at the same time complete letting go of it is there in the way that you're supposed to go about focusing. The Bhagavad Gita describes meditation in its 6th chapter that way. Anchor the mind somewhere, and when it drifts, bring it back. That's something that's there in meditation traditions. So I think there is a bit of a gray area there, but it's definitely not about making shapes.
Yeah. Thanks for confirming that. That's what I thought. Okay, thank you.
No worries, you're welcome. So what have we got here outside of the Yoga Sutra? Well, now we're into the tricky bit. What other texts do you think are most relevant and important to study in our modern world and in a yoga teacher training setting to get a more rounded understanding of the history of yoga? To plug myself, I wrote a book in which I tried to sum up what's in the main ones that people look at, which are the Yoga Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita, the early Upanishads, parts of the Mahabharata, which go into a lot more detail than the Bhagavad Gita itself, and really probably are the sources of what Patanjali is later summarizing. So all of that is there, but none of that's really got that much to do with modern yoga practice. We need probably to look more at the medieval Hatha Yoga traditions, and even then to be confronted by how different physical yoga was even 500 years ago. I mean, just look at the 3rd chapter of the Hatha Pradipika. Once you've done a bit of asana and pranayama, it's all onto funky stuff, cheating death by keeping your semen in your head, for example. It's a completely different worldview. So there's lots of tools in there to see that are consistent, still being drawn on in the same way that there's tools in the early Upanishads, in the Yoga Sutra, that are part of modern yoga. But I think part of the study process is to look at how different all of these texts are to what we're doing today. And somewhere around here, in fact, it's just up over there. Let me go and grab it, because I was just speaking to the authors of this book the other day for my podcast, a book called Is This Yoga? A couple of American scholars, Anya Foxon and Krista Kubery, and they are looking there at all of the different things that have intersected in the creation of modern yoga, and some of them are quite surprising. There are traditions of philosophy in the Western world dating back to ancient Greece that are very similar in their frameworks to yoga philosophies. So I'm not suggesting that in order to just do a 200-hour training you need a mastery of world religions or anything of that sort, but I think it helps to just dip into a little bit of all of these sources and actually be confronted by their difference, rather than trying to make them all add up to where we are now, and then to approach it a little bit like this book, looking backwards from the present day and saying, well, where in any of all that is what we're doing? And if we can't find, the absolute blueprints for modern yoga there, perhaps we need to acknowledge that modern yoga is a hybrid of lots of different influences. And therefore, the way that we make sense of it will need to be a bit of a hybrid. And we'll need to get involved in it. And part of, I think, foundational yoga teacher training ought to be, you need to write for yourself, what is yoga as I understand it? What are my objectives in being a yoga practitioner? How do they relate to the objectives I find in these old texts? And to be honest about the difference, and to be honest, therefore, about the need to bridge that gap somehow. And then to start thinking about, is there a way to do that with respect for some of the general principles in these texts? Can we keep alive a connection to the spirit of an older tradition, even if the actual, 100% following it to the letter is not what we're interested in? So, I don't think we need to look at different texts necessarily. I think we just perhaps need to look at them differently, let them speak to us in ways that sound a bit alienating sometimes, rather than trying to, as Iyengar did in that quote that I put together at the beginning, make it sound like everything fits together seamlessly. But that's India. All sorts of things get jumbled together and made to fit together seamlessly. The yoga tradition is that way. Throughout its history, it mixes things together from different sources and acts as if nothing's ever changed and it's all timeless. So that's just the nature of what we're dealing with. But unless we've grown up in that worldview, that's not intuitive to us. And we're living in the modern world and we're teaching students, and it helps to not confuse them anymore by making it sound like Patanjali has got the basic instructions for what we do in a 90-minute asana class. So another question, is Sthira Sukham Asanam a means to yoga, or is yoga a means to the steadiness and comfort, or both? It's a very good question. I think there's a line of commentary that goes with the 6th sutra of the 3rd chapter, which says it's quoted on the back of a very helpful text. I've used this so much that my cover fell off. Roots of Yoga by Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton. And if you really want to dive deep into other texts, that's a great place to look. It's not bedtime reading. It's quite dense, but it's full of extracts from 100+ different texts. And they quote in there from this line of commentary when defining yoga, noting that there is this quite sort of idiosyncratic flavor to it. It's very hard to work out whether yoga is the practice or yoga is the result. Definitely early texts define yoga as a state of being that different practices can attain, all of these compounds. Hatha yoga by means of this hatha, forceful effort, mastery of bodily forces perhaps. Bhakti yogic state attained by means of devotion. So that's pretty clear. And yet at the same time, the thing that you do to steady your mind is to steady your mind by focusing. So you might not have it completely still at first, and trying to still it might be a very unhelpful way to go about it. But certainly trying to focus, and then when the focus goes, coming back to focusing is a technique. So it says here in this quote, yoga is to be known through yoga. Yoga arises from yoga. One who is vigilant by means of yoga delights in yoga for a long time. So that letting go, absorption in the infinite, ananta samapati, that was sort of suggested to be part of the process of getting into a steady, comfortable posture, is already well on the way towards steadiness of mind, because you're totally unbothered by physical discomfort, says the next sutra. Maybe isn't the absolute attainment of yoga, but it's in the same territory. So I think there's a cyclical relationship between steadiness and ease of all sorts, steadiness and ease in the mind, and the ultimate goal of being in a state beyond the mind. And somehow the two feed each other. The more we can rest in this clarity, the easier it is to come back to. So even just as I was saying, recognizing its emergence once in a while is a helpful thing to be aware of. So I think in the end, though, we need to come back to the fact that yoga is about concentration, and for Patanjali, the refinement of concentration takes us beyond the phenomenal world as we know it. And that's just something other than what we're familiar with. So even trying to relate it back to what we might do with those words, Sthira Sukham Asanam, it can be misleading. In the end, I think it's helpful to just come back to the fact that postural yoga is its own thing. It's probably more helpful to think of it as a tool for concentration, and to think of, therefore, the possibility of a bit of mental steadiness. And in that respect, I would say the last, 18 or so verses of the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, from about 255, 256 onwards, they are much more helpful guides to what most of us think we're doing than the Yoga Sūtra. They're talking about maintaining a steady mind in the midst of worldly life. And what does it look like to be in a state of samadhi, a state of profound concentration, while at the same time not letting go of the body, the mind, and the world completely. Maintaining the capacity to act with skill is the way that the Bhagavad Gita would spin it. And that's the opposite of what Patanjali has to say. Most of us want to interpret his text through the prism of the Gita. I think it helps much more to see the two as different, but using the same raw materials for different purposes. The Gita is for life in the world. The Yoga Sutra is for life in the cave. And probably better that we leave it that way, and at the same time see that there's still some very helpful preliminary steps that we can make use of in the world. And that's probably, what the Gita has done with the same source material. It's just said, well, there's another way of spinning this that doesn't lead to letting go of worldly life. Anything else before we start to wind up? Yes, Nicholas.
Yeah, last question. I haven't read your books, or maybe it's something you've talked about before, but I'm a scientist, so I sometimes wonder if there's analogies that can be done between how history evolved in science and how history evolved in yoga. And for example, in my mind, like Newtonian physics, we still study it, and there's a lot of useful things, and yet the worldview is not the whole story. And thanks to that theory, other theories were born that were more, comprehensive, or that were that went further or were different. And I was wondering if you see a similar kind of build, a kind of a directionality to the evolution of yoga, where maybe Patanjalian yoga is more dualistic, and at a certain point there's more non-dual philosophy that starts to appear, and is that kind of refining and going a step further than other yoga, and yeah, just wondering how you think about the in this evolutionary sense. Is there like a directionality, or is are different yogas in medieval times, they're just different, and there's no building block?
I think just different is a really helpful way to think of things, and also to I guess go against the instinctive search for a linear explanation of things, because that doesn't seem to be how a lot of traditional Indian systems work. They're much more cyclical, and things come in and out of fashion, and they get remixed into different packages. So building blocks, as you just said at the end there, is a really helpful way to think about it. I wrote my book basically breaking it down into almost 100 different things that have been of some relevance at different stages of yoga history, and people remix those into different combinations at different times. And I think that's what happens, and therefore it's also kind of tempting, I think, to think that there's some sort of hierarchy of evolution. And there is, particularly in the modern yoga world, one way of seeing that does tend to sort of try and straddle all the others and present itself as the apex of an understanding of consciousness, in the form of non-dual tantric teachings, particularly the Hindu Shaiva variety, coming from particularly teachers in the Kashmir Valley about 1,000 years ago. And that's often presented as this kind of sublime apex of evolution from a dualistic perspective to a non-dual understanding. And that's how that works in that system, but that's not the only system. And the world of yoga contains multiple ways of seeing. There are frameworks built on duality. They also leads to the same state of pure consciousness. There are frameworks built on a combination of duality and non-duality. There are even, frameworks, for example, in Buddhism, built on a much more complicated understanding of the fact that there's nothing other than this confusing mess that can be seen as entirely interconnected, and yet none of it is permanent. So it's form and emptiness combined. So things can be quite mind-bending, and that starts to get into the quantum realm, I guess. I'm not much of a physicist, but the possibility of being both things at once I was thinking of there. So I don't know that it necessarily consists of evolution over time to the highest level. Otherwise, that in some ways that would mean that goat yoga is the culmination of the evolution of these teachings. But I think in terms of Indian systems, they have their own logic, and it is more helpful to see how one works and to use that framework clearly, rather than to do what often happens, which is cherry pick a bit of this and a bit of that, and then you end up with this sort of soup that doesn't really have a particular flavor. It's kind of whatever the taste of beige is, that's how it tastes. So I think there is that temptation in the yoga world, because we've got access to all this material. Originally, you'd have just gone to a teacher, a little bit like when I first went to an asana class. I had no idea what it was. I just went. It was yoga, and suddenly I found myself going down a particular yoga rabbit hole. And 10 years in, thought maybe I want to get out of this one and try a different one. And I think that would be how it would be with philosophical systems as well. And we each have a different inclination. I think different things speak to us. So there's no necessary hierarchy in the sense that non-duality is better than duality. We live in a world of dualistic relationships. You can't have a relationship between things if all things are one. So that might be the ultimate truth, but it's actually dispensed with for everyday purposes, even in the traditions that promote it. There's an acceptance of a transactional, conventional realm in which we have to exist unless we're going full steam ahead, set the controls for the heart of the sun. So I think we end up finding it very difficult to live in the ultimate state, whichever system we adopt. But it is more helpful to know whether you're trying to turn left or trying to turn right. And in the end, if you turn left enough and turn right enough, you quite probably end up in the same place.
Thanks.
Welcome. Okay, well, I'm going to slowly wind up then for now. And as I mentioned, there is this course. If you want to carry on chatting in this fashion, we'll be doing that every Sunday in June and also the first Sunday in July. And you can explore what it all looks like on this link, which I'll also share for those watching the recording later who won't have access to the chat. And as I mentioned, if you type in this code at the checkout, you get 10% off before Friday. So it'd be lovely if some of you could join me. It's been fun to have questions, and thank you, Nicholas, for braving the going on screen and talking dimension of things. It's nice to not just listen to my own voice, and be lovely to hear some of you and to share ideas together, because in the end it's an inquiry in which we're all engaged. I'm just another practitioner, teacher, student myself. I'm not the possessor of all the answers, but I've got a lot of books lying around me which I will be very happy to delve into with you. So hopefully see some of you for that soon. And for now, thanks for coming and joining me this evening. Wish you an enjoyable rest of the week, and hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thanks, Daniel. Bye for now. Lovely. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay. See ya.